Here we start in the new section in the Renaissance. We're leaving behind the Middle Ages, and now we have the rise of the 1400s to the middle of the 1600s, and we come to a rebirth. The word Renaissance means rebirth. And this is a rebirth of many of the humanist ideals that were pulling all the way back from time from ancient Greece and Rome. So if there happens to be a test question about what the Renaissance was a rebirth of, it's the Greek and Roman ideals. Let's say that one last time. If there is a test question that talks about what is the rebirth of the Renaissance going toward, it's to the Greek and Roman ideology, all right, of mankind. And there is going to be a rebirth of their literature, a rebirth of artistry, a rebirth of looking at themselves as being the most central and great of all beings. And during this time, you have a grand political structure intertwined with faith in the church. And so over the last 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, from the fall of Rome to before the Renaissance, was the Middle Ages, which we've just finished up. Those 1,000 years where the church was the predominant figure. The church was the leading role, leading role, and if you were to become king, it was the church that crowned you king. In fact, there is a famous story of one king who got on the wrong side of the church, got ousted from his church, and had to sleep outside in the cold until the Pope had said, okay, you can be king and be let back in your own castle. So the church had a magnificent role there during those years of the Middle Ages. Whereas now in the Renaissance, you're going to see a shift. You're going to see a shift. And this shift is going to take place primarily when you have certain political events that now pull at the church and tug at the church, and you're going to see a definite break. All right? And this break, one of the main breaks, all starts with King Henry VIII. Okay. Henry is the King of England, and he is married for 20 years to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And 20 years go by, and she has not produced a son. Now, according to the church, according to the Catholic Church, there is no divorce. But he says, I'm a king. I need a son, right? A king needs a son to pass down the throne to. Well, she hasn't given him a son. And he says he wants this divorce, and so instead, he goes to the Pope and says, so you need to go ahead and grant me a divorce. And the Pope says, you can't get a divorce. And he says, well, we've never actually finished the marriage in 20 years, so therefore we should have an annulment. The Pope says, you can't get an annulment after 20 years. He says, that's not how the church does this. And so instead, he decides to break with the Catholic Church. And he says, you know what? The King of England is now the head of our own church. And this is where you get the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. And he decides that his word will now be law, and his word will be scripture. And so he starts a new church, and they break with the Catholic Church in Rome. And Henry now is freed up to marry Anne Boleyn, number 2 of the 6 wives of the list. Okay? And so goes forth, he goes and goes and goes and tries to find someone who will give him a son. He ends up having 2 daughters and 1 son, but who does not survive very long. And so a very sickly young boy. And Henry VIII, therefore, turns around, and he has now, from this one action, is going to bring a huge dramatic shift in power, in politics, and the religious ideals, and this huge paradigm shift, because 1 son was not born. Now, what's interesting about this is some of the literature that's going to come out of this from one of his most trusted advisors. In fact, his royal chancellor is a man named Sir Thomas More. And before he became the royal chancellor, he posed a question. And this question is going to be taken up in this small little book called, I'll go to the name in just a moment. But I'm going to leave the question to you. How would you create the perfect society? What would make the perfect society? Anyone?
There's no such thing as perfect society.
But if you can make one, you say there's no such thing as a perfect society. And granted, we've got a lot of history to prove otherwise. But this is going on at the same time. Now let's talk about what's going on in the world around this time. Just recently, during the time of Sir Thomas More's writing, there is a man, a man who has now traveled some distance and found a new land, a new world, dare I say. And this new world, that he has actually created a map of it and started telling people. Now you might be thinking, Christopher Columbus. But Christopher Columbus wasn't that vocal except to a Spanish king and queen. But this other man actually has this entire hemisphere named after him. And if you've heard of his name, Amerigo Vespucci. And you live on the continent of North America. Where do you think you get that from? It's from Amerigo Vespucci. It's not that he discovered it, it's that he was very vocal about it. And he drew really good maps. And so Amerigo Vespucci is actually mentioned in the first page of this as men are getting together, 3 of them in fact, and they have this question of what would make the perfect society? To you, if I were to ask you, you have a new world that has not been tainted by anything yet. She's like, how lovely would that be? A big sigh of relief. Let me ask you this. It's the same feeling you get when you move into your new house. I haven't messed up anything in this house yet.
Not yet.
All right? Or you get that new car and you have the new car feeling, right? The new car smell as you get inside and you breathe in the chemicals rather deeply. And there's this new car and it's still shiny and there's no dents or scratches on it yet.
Yes.
And so we're asking the same question. There is a new world, a new land, and how do we make a new society? Because there's so much corruption across Europe. There's so much greed. There's so many religious struggles between the religions and the politics. And this king and that king. It's literally a soap opera of Europe. And we might hit some of that next week. But right now, how would we start this new land? How would we make the perfect new world? What would you do? What would you include?
You're looking for answers? Okay.
Yes, I'm looking for answers. This is not a. This is not rhetorical.
This is not a silent one.
Right.
Nobody has an idea of what would make a better society?
Code of respect.
A
One
code?
law. Respect everyone and everything around you.
I love this. Respect everyone and everything. That's a great law. Next. Come on, what's another one?
No, it's not.
No coffee.
Respect the Word of God. Okay, so therefore everyone should
No
have
coffee.
time to focus on the Word of God. What else? Every person should. What else?
No coffee.
You have to.
No coffee?
No coffee.
I'm not coming to your utopia.
No,
Mine either.
It's not perfect.
Okay, Edvin?
You have to.
Yes.
You have to have. Facilities like education and maybe hospitals or start developing.
So hospitals and education and food for all people.
Food, yeah.
For all people, no matter class, right? Okay, these are good ideas. What else?
Coffee.
What else? Any other ideas? School uniforms.
Oh no.
Okay, what else? Keep going.
Free money.
Free money. Okay, that's another idea. What else?
Free education.
Free education. What else?
Is this communist or something?
Huh?
Is this communist society?
Something like
It's
that.
whatever you make it. What do you want in your new world?
But everything's free.
Yeah.
But everything is free? We'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm asking you a question. How do you imagine your perfect society? What would you include in that perfect society? Danielson, what do you think?
No evil.
No evil. I like this. What else? What?
Is it
No
a fairy
killing.
tale? Is it fairy tale or real?
This is the story. This is the question
Oh, a
that Sir
story,
Thomas More
okay.
poses to future generations and to the generation at that time during the Renaissance. And it is how to create the perfect society. In fact, More is in his own book. He's one of the 3 gentlemen talking.
A justice system, just in case people start breaking the laws. Amen.
And a justice system just in case they start breaking the law.
Just in case.
You go to jail one time, you got life.
Wow.
Okay, what else? Anything else? What? Equality for all people. Okay, I like this. Anything else? Well, Sir Thomas More comes up with this idea. In fact, in the story, Sir Thomas More actually meets a man that he knows. All right, he meets a man named Giles, and Giles is talking to a stranger. And that day, no, we're not doing that one. Not right now. All right, and Giles is talking to a stranger, and he introduces this young stranger as Raphael. Let me actually make sure I have the name pronounced correctly. Hold on. Because I was looking at and double checking, but I want to say Hallidays, but that sounds like a sauce, so hold on. Hold on. Hythloday, excuse me. I was in Hallidays. I knew that was wrong. Hythloday. And to go back to, it's interesting, Hythloday, if you look back in the Latin, Hythloday, instead of a giver of wisdom, Hythloday gets its root word from the giver of foolishness. Interesting. But that doesn't mean that everything's going to say is foolishness. So Hythloday has gone on travels. He's so tired of Europe. He was so tired of the corruption that he goes on travels because Amerigo Vespucci has found a new land. He's made his maps. They're going on travels to a new world. And Hythloday talks about this amazing travel and how far it was to get there to this beautiful island. And this island is called Utopia. And Utopia, on Utopia, there is no war. There is almost no criminal activity whatsoever. There is no poverty. There is no injustice. In fact, all people are equal, no matter race. Women at this time were actually considered to be the lowest class of citizenship at this time would have been women. It had nothing to do with color or race at the time. It had everything to do with gender. And women had equal rights of voting, of property ownership. Sounds like a pretty good place. There's no war. There's barely any prison. And there's a very, very small amount of police force. You didn't have a real strong police force. And so the question is, wow, this sounds beautiful. In fact, you said free money. There was no money. In fact, they used gold and silver, ready, to shackle the few prisoners that they had. It was all on wasted things. Like, imagine having a gold toilet. Really, it's not worth all that much. Okay? And so that's what they said. Their gold and silver wasn't even valuable because they did not have any use for money. Everyone was educated, and everyone only had to work 6 hours a day. Now, this is huge in Renaissance time period when people were working 12, 13, 14-hour days, and all of a sudden everyone works to only 6 hours a day. That's considered freedom. But everybody works those 6-hour days. Women were given the same training as men to do the same jobs as men, having equal say as men. And they had so much spare time that every person would actually be so disciplined that they would all receive additional education, going to seminars and classes like the one in which you're sitting. But they were so disciplined, they actually get up and go to class ready before dawn. And all of a sudden, I just lost Angela. And you're right, they did have school uniforms. In fact, everyone had the same dress code. No one had a variety of clothing. You wore the same clothing. And your home looked exactly like somebody else's home. There were about 10 to 16 adults per home. And every 30 households of 10 to 16 adults had a vote for someone to be in office and sort of do like a family-style government over those 30 households, which they'd be voted on annually. And then there would be another one, about 200 of those subgroups would have another person who would annually be done. But, ready? If someone, you want to talk about politics, because politics is so corrupt, if you ever ran for office, you were immediately disqualified. If you ever ran for office, you were immediately disqualified. If you wanted the job, you could not get it. And so Sir Thomas More starts to give us questions, and we start to, at one point, start to read Utopia and think, this sounds really, really good. This sounds like a perfect society. But then all of a sudden, you start looking a little bit more and going, you start questioning, wait a minute, no individuality, no pay for work well done. no war, but very little government system. Everybody has to be involved in the military action. All of a sudden, you start to have a little bit more concern, and those things that seemed once so perfect, now we start to raise our eyebrows and start to question, is this truly wisdom? So we get a whole genre of literature, and even film today, based on the book Utopia. And we call it a dystopia. A dystopia. A dystopia is where we think it's a perfect and beautiful society, but something in it seems off. It seems wrong in some way. And so the question remains, what is wrong with a dystopia, and why does it always seem to fail? Now, some people took Sir Thomas More's book and actually became a founding document for communism and for Karl Marx, as you talk about Marxism, taking that concept of everyone has the same. And in fact, on a missions trip to Moldova, when both my parents were teaching at a seminary, there would be brand new buildings that were actually constructed new and were made to look old, like the building next to it.
Wow.
So that no one person living in there would have any different living dwelling than someone else. Others have taken that to say that you cannot form a perfect society upon the face of this earth. And still others say that in every attempt to try for the perfect society, we still end up with some form of national sin. Can you give me an example of a dystopia and how it attempts to be perfect, following Utopia, More's Utopia, and instead has now become a dystopic ideal or paradigm?